At 9:02 a.m. on the 27th of August, 1896, the most powerful navy in the history of the world opened fire on a wooden palace. By 9:40 a.m., 38 minutes later, it was over. The palace was a smoking ruin. Around 500 people were dead or wounded, and the flag of the Sultanate of Zanzibar, on the only mast still standing, had been shot down into the dirt. On the other side, the side doing the shooting, there was exactly one casualty, a British sailor. He wasn't even hit by the enemy. He was hurt by his own ship's gun. This is the Anglo-Zanzibar War. It is, depending on which historian you ask, somewhere between 38 and 45 minutes long. And it is, by general consensus, the shortest war in recorded history.
Shorter than the time it takes to watch a single episode of a TV drama, shorter than a university lecture, shorter than this video is going to be. And here's the thing that should bother you about that fact, once you sit with it for more than a few seconds. A war that short, with casualties that lopsided, isn't really a war in the sense that word usually means. Wars are supposed to be contests, two sides with some plausible chance of winning, slogging it out until one breaks. This wasn't a contest. This was something else, wearing the costume of a war. So today we're going to do two things. First, we're going to actually tell you the story, who Khalid bin Barghash was, why he barricaded himself in a palace against the express wishes of the most powerful empire on earth, and what happened in those 38 minutes.
But second, and this is really the point of the video, we're going to use this absurd, almost comic historical footnote to understand something much bigger, how the era of wars as evenly matched contests between sovereign nations quietly ended and what replaced it. Because the Anglo-Zanzibar War isn't really an outlier, it's a preview. To understand why a fleet of British warships was sitting in a harbor off the coast of East Africa in 1896, you have to go back about 100 years before that, to a very different Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a small archipelago, really just two main islands, sitting off the coast of what's now Tanzania, in the Indian Ocean. For centuries, its location made it one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the planet because it sat directly on the trade routes connecting East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and beyond. Monsoon winds that blow reliably in one direction for half the year and the opposite direction for the other half meant that if you parked your ships at Zanzibar, you could ride those winds out to India and back, or down to Mozambique and back, on a predictable annual schedule. It was a natural hub. Sailors had known this for over 1,000 years. By the early 1800s, Zanzibar wasn't just a stopover. It had become the seat of power for the Sultanate of Oman, ruled from across the Indian Ocean. Sultan Saeed bin Sultan, who ruled Oman, found Zanzibar so much more valuable than his mainland capital that in 1840, he essentially moved his entire court there. Zanzibar became the de facto capital of an Omani Arab maritime empire, and it grew extraordinarily wealthy, not from one trade, but from two, intertwined in a way that's deeply uncomfortable to look at directly.
The first was spices. Zanzibar's soil and climate turned out to be perfect for growing cloves, and plantation owners, many of them Arab landowners who'd settled on the island, turned it into one of the world's dominant clove producers. At its peak, Zanzibar was producing the majority of the world's clove supply. The second trade, the one that made the spice plantations possible and made Zanzibar genuinely rich, was human beings. Zanzibar was the largest slave trading port in East Africa.
Caravans pushed deep into the African interior, sometimes 1,000 miles inland, capturing and purchasing people who were then marched to the coast and shipped to Zanzibar's slave market, the largest of its kind on the entire eastern side of the continent. From there, people were sold onward. Zanzibar's market alone was moving on the order of 50,000 enslaved people a year at its height, with estimates of total volume across the century running into the hundreds of thousands. This is the wealth that built the Sultanate of Zanzibar into a regional power with real diplomatic weight, enough that European empires took it seriously as an independent state, not just a piece of territory waiting to be carved up. And that's the paradox sitting right at the center of this story, one we're going to come back to again and again. The British government's stated public justification for getting involved in Zanzibar's internal politics was ending the slave trade. That's not propaganda. Britain really had committed itself, since abolishing slavery in its own empire decades earlier, to suppressing the slave trade globally, and the Royal Navy really did spend enormous resources patrolling the Indian Ocean intercepting slave ships.
And this is the part that gets quietly dropped from the heroic version of the story. That moral mission also happened to be an extremely convenient pretext for inserting British power directly into the internal affairs of a wealthy, strategically located, formally independent country that Britain wanted to control. You can believe both things were true at once. Historians mostly do. The slave trade actually was a humanitarian catastrophe, and Britain actually did care about ending it. And Britain also used that cause again and again to justify steadily tightening its grip on Zanzibar's sovereignty, vetoing sultans, controlling armies, dictating foreign policy, until the sultanate that remained was, as one 19th century commentator at the time put it bluntly, basically a puppet wearing a crown. By the 1890s, that's exactly what Zanzibar had become.
In 1890, two competing European empires sat down and drew a line on a map of East Africa. This was the era historians call the Scramble for Africa, a roughly 2-decade stretch where European powers, mostly without consulting a single African government, carved the continent into spheres of influence and outright colonies. Britain and Germany were the two heavyweights jostling for East Africa specifically, and in 1890 they signed something called the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty. Germany traded away its claims to influence over Zanzibar in exchange for a small North Sea island called Heligoland, useful for German naval strategy, and in return, Britain got a green light to do essentially whatever it wanted with Zanzibar.
That same year, Britain formally declared Zanzibar a British protectorate. Protectorate is one of those words from the colonial era that sounds almost gentle, like Britain was offering Zanzibar protection as a favor. What it actually meant was that Zanzibar kept its own sultan, its own flag, its own outward symbols of sovereignty, and Britain controlled everything that actually mattered: foreign policy, military matters, and, crucially for our story, the question of who got to sit on the throne in the first place. The treaty establishing the protectorate gave Britain an effective veto over the choice of sultan. Every successor had to be approved by the British Council before being recognized. So, when Sultan Ali bin Said died in 1893, the British made it very clear they had a preference, and that preference was a man named Hamad bin Thuwaini. Hamad was seen, correctly, as compliant, pliable, willing to work within British wishes rather than against them. He became the 5th sultan in this line, and for 3 years he mostly did what was expected. He kept good relations with the British consulate. He didn't make trouble. But compliant doesn't mean uncontested at home. Among ordinary Zanzibaris, and especially among the Arab elite who'd built their wealth on the old order, there was real, simmering resentment.
Resentment at the loss of the slave trade as Britain pressured for its abolition, resentment at British officers effectively running the local military, resentment in general at watching a once independent maritime power get hollowed out into a flag with no authority behind it. Hamad, perhaps sensing this pressure from both directions, Britain pushing him to be more compliant, his own subjects pushing him to assert more independence, did something interesting near the end of his reign. With British authorization, he raised a personal bodyguard, a Zanzibari palace guard about 1,000 strong. The stated purpose was internal security, but this armed force, loyal specifically to the Sultan rather than to British command structures, started getting into friction with the British-led police force on the island. European residents complained about the bodyguards' conduct. There was tension building under a calm surface.
And then, on the 25th of August, 1896, Sultan Hamad died, suddenly, at his palace at around 11:40 in the morning. Almost immediately, rumors started that he'd been poisoned, that his nephew had done it. We should be honest here about what the historical record actually supports. There's no proven case of murder. Hamad may simply have died of natural causes. He wasn't an old man, but sudden deaths happened often enough in this period without foul play. What we know for certain is what happened next, and it's the hinge the entire war swings on. Within hours of Hamad's death, some accounts say within 3 hours, his cousin, a 29-year-old man named Khalid bin Barghash, moved into the palace complex in Zanzibar town and declared himself the new sultan. This was, by the letter of the treaty, completely illegal. The Protectorate Agreement required British approval before any succession was recognized. Khalid had skipped that step entirely. He hadn't asked. He just walked in and sat down.
Now, it's worth pausing on who Khalid actually was, because the way this story gets told in trivia format, a guy refused to leave a palace and got bombed for it, makes him sound almost cartoonishly stubborn, and that's not really fair to the situation he was in. Khalid had a genuine claim to legitimacy in the eyes of many Zanzibaris. Succession in the Sultanate wasn't strictly hereditary by formal law, but Khalid was the son of a previous, well-regarded sultan, Barghash bin Said, and he argued, not unreasonably from a local political standpoint, that he had as much right to the throne as anyone, especially since he felt sidelined after his father's death years earlier. He had support. Hundreds, by some accounts up to 2,000 or 3,000 armed followers and palace staff rallied to him within the palace walls.
This wasn't a lone eccentric locking himself in a room. This was, in Zanzibari domestic politics, an actual claimant with an actual base of support, doing what claimants in contested successions have done across human history, seizing the physical seat of power and daring anyone to remove him. The British, on the other hand, did not want Khalid. They'd already picked someone else. Britain's senior diplomat overseeing East Africa, a man named Arthur Hardinge, had a clear preference for the throne. A different relative, Hamoud bin Mohammed, who the British consul on the ground believed would be cooperative, specifically someone who wouldn't resist the continued abolition of slavery and who would continue the pattern of compliance Hamad had mostly maintained.
The acting consul in Zanzibar, Harding was actually away at the time, was a man named Basil Cave, and Cave moved fast. He sent word to Khalid, step down, leave the palace and accept British authority, or face the consequences. Khalid refused. And here is where the story tits from tense diplomatic standoff into, we are actually about to have a war, because the British did not bluff. They started bringing in firepower. By the morning of August 27th, roughly 36 hours after Khalid first occupied the palace, the harbor outside Zanzibar town was full of British warships. Sources differ slightly on the exact count, but it was something like 5 Royal Navy vessels, cruisers and gunboats, including HMS St. George, HMS Philomel, HMS Raccoon, HMS Thrush, and HMS Sparrow.
On land, Basil Cave assembled a force of loyal Zanzibari troops, pro-British soldiers under the command of a British-appointed general, Lloyd Matthews, somewhere between 900 and possibly more, plus around 150 British Marines and sailors who'd come ashore. Inside the palace, Khalid had roughly 2,800 people behind the barricades. Most of them were not professional soldiers. They were palace staff, servants, and a hastily armed civilian population, ordinary residents who'd rallied to Khalid's cause, alongside some artillery pieces and a scattering of machine guns positioned to face the harbor, where everyone could see the Royal Navy sitting at anchor. At 8 a.m. on the 27th, Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, commanding the British naval force, sent an unambiguous ultimatum: lower your flag, leave the palace, and surrender by 9 a.m. or we open fire. This is the moment in the story I find genuinely fascinating because it tells you something about how people process power they've never personally witnessed in action. At around 8 a.m., with the deadline looming, Khalid sent a message asking to negotiate, to parley. The British refused. The terms of the ultimatum stood, full stop. And Khalid, by multiple accounts, responded with something close to, "I don't believe you'll actually do it." He was betting that the threat was a bluff, that a European power wouldn't actually open fire and kill people over a domestic succession dispute on a small island that, in the grand scheme of the British Empire, was a relatively minor possession. He was wrong, and the way he found out he was wrong is the next 38 minutes.
9 a.m. came and went. The flag stayed up over the palace. Nothing happened for 2 more minutes. At 9:02 a.m., the British ships opened fire. It's worth actually picturing this physically, because the asymmetry here is almost surreal. The palace complex in Zanzibar town consisted of 3 connected buildings sitting right on the waterfront, the palace itself, an attached harem called the Beit al-Hukum, and a grand ceremonial building called the Beit al-Ajaib, the House of Wonders, notable for being reportedly the first building in East Africa wired for electricity. These buildings were constructed mostly out of local timber. They were palatial, they were ornate, they were absolutely not designed to withstand naval artillery, because nobody who built them had ever imagined they'd need to.
Against this, the Royal Navy brought modern, breech-loading naval guns mounted on armored steel warships capable of firing high-explosive shells at a target that wasn't moving, wasn't shooting back effectively, and had nowhere to retreat to. Within minutes, the defenders' own artillery, the guns Khalid's people had pointed at the harbor, was knocked out. The wooden palace structures caught fire almost immediately and began burning. Some of the defenders, including reportedly Khalid himself, didn't wait around once the shells started landing. They fled the complex in the opening minutes of the bombardment. There was a small naval engagement too, almost a footnote within the larger footnote. Zanzibar's only warship, a wooden royal yacht called HHS Glasgow, originally built as a pleasure vessel for an earlier sultan, who reportedly never even liked using it, fired back at HMS St. George. St. George returned fire and sank it within minutes. The crew was rescued from the water. For the next 18 years, locals could apparently still see the Glasgow's masts sticking up out of the harbor at low tide, a quiet, lingering monument to how this all went. On land, British-aligned troops advanced toward the palace grounds and took some scattered, largely ineffective gunfire from Khalid's remaining defenders as they moved in. By somewhere between 9:40 and 9:45 a.m., the flagpole over the ruined palace, the flag that had stood there in defiance of the British ultimatum, had been shot down. With the flag gone and the palace burning, organized resistance collapsed. The fighting stopped. Most sources land on 38 minutes as the duration, measuring from the first shots at 9:02 to the ceasefire around 9:40. Some count slightly longer, to 40 or even 45 minutes, depending on exactly which moment you call the end. But every reasonable accounting agrees on the same essential fact. This was over in well under an hour. The human cost, when you actually sit with the numbers, is where the story stops being absurd and starts being genuinely grim. Approximately 500 people on the Zanzibari side were killed or wounded, overwhelmingly palace defenders, staff, and ordinary people who'd been swept into Khalid's cause, many of them civilians who had no real say in the politics that put them there. On the British side, 1 sailor, injured, and by some accounts injured not even by enemy fire, but by an accident with his own ship's weaponry during the action, 500 to 1 in 38 minutes. In the chaos immediately following the ceasefire, looting broke out in parts of Zanzibar town, reportedly killing around 20 more people before British-aligned forces, including a contingent of Sikh troops brought in for the purpose, restored order in the streets.
Khalid himself escaped the palace during the bombardment and made his way to the German consulate, seeking asylum. The Germans granted it. And in a small but telling postscript to the imperial rivalry that had shaped this entire region, German diplomats later helped smuggle him out of British-controlled Zanzibar entirely, eventually relocating him to German East Africa, where he lived for the next 2 decades, safely outside Britain's jurisdiction, until the British finally captured him during the First World War and exiled him to the Seychelles and then St. Helena. He eventually returned to East Africa and died there in 1927, having spent more than 3 decades as a footnote to his own 38 minutes of resistance. By that same afternoon, the afternoon of the bombardment itself, the British had installed their original preferred candidate, Hamud bin Mohammed, as the new sultan. The succession crisis that had triggered the entire war was resolved, on British terms, before the day was even over.
Here's where I want to slow down and ask a question that I think is more interesting than anything we've covered so far. Why do we call this a war at all? By any conventional definition you might reach for, this doesn't look like one. There was no real military balance. The outcome was never genuinely in doubt from the moment British ships arrived in the harbor. There was no campaign, no maneuvering over territory, no sustained engagement between comparable forces. There was an ultimatum, a deadline, and then 38 minutes of one side bombarding a building until the other side's flag came down. And yet historians, almost universally, do call it a war, the Anglo-Zanzibar War, and Guinness World Records famously certifies it as the shortest war in recorded history. So what's actually doing the definitional work here?
Part of the answer is almost embarrassingly simple. There was a formal declaration of hostilities, 2 named belligerents, the British Empire and the Sultanate of Zanzibar, recognized at the time as a sovereign protectorate state, an ultimatum, an act of armed force, and a surrender. Structurally, on paper, it checks the boxes. International law and military historians don't typically require a war to be evenly matched to qualify as a war. They require it to be a state of armed conflict between political entities. The Anglo-Zanzibar War technically clears that bar in 38 minutes, the same way a sprinter technically finishes a marathon if you let them start at mile 26. But there's a more interesting answer underneath that one, and it's the one I actually want to dig into. The reason this looks so absurd to us, looking back, is that it's sitting at a genuine turning point in what military force even meant.
For most of human history, going back thousands of years, war was brutally, but also somewhat democratically, a contest of roughly comparable forces. Sure, empires beat tribes, and large armies usually beat small ones, but usually is the key word. Even badly mismatched conflicts before the industrial era tended to take time because the technology of killing hadn't yet outpaced the technology of resisting. A walled city could hold out against a siege for months or years. A guerrilla force in difficult terrain could bleed a larger army for a generation. Outcomes were often lopsided, but they weren't usually instant, because both sides were working with roughly the same category of tools: iron weapons, fortifications, manpower, supply lines that took comparable effort to maintain on both sides. What changed in the 19th century is that one side, industrialized European empires, developed weapons technology that simply outran what the other side could resist with by an order of magnitude that hadn't really existed in human history before.
Breech-loading artillery, steam-powered, steel-hulled warships that could sit in a harbor unaffected by wind or tide and fire shells with precision at a fixed target, machine guns. This wasn't an incremental military advantage, like a slightly better sword or a slightly larger army. It was a generational leap that meant a force of a few hundred Europeans, backed by a handful of ships, could now reliably defeat forces of thousands in places they'd never previously been able to project power into at all. The Anglo-Zanzibar War is almost a clean laboratory demonstration of exactly that gap, compressed into 38 minutes, because there was nothing in between the two sides' capabilities to slow it down. No walled fortress could withstand naval artillery. No spear or rifle on the palace side could meaningfully threaten an armored ship in open water.
The contest wasn't really a contest in any meaningful military sense. It was closer to a demonstration of force that happened to require live ammunition. And this is genuinely the argument that historians like Gwyn Dyer make about this whole period of imperial conflict, in his survey of the history of war more broadly, that the 19th century quietly broke something fundamental about what war had always been. For most of the history of organized human violence, war was, terribly, a relatively level field. Both sides had skin in the game in roughly comparable ways, and the outcome, while often grim, usually reflected something real about relative strength, will, or strategy on both sides. The industrial era broke that leveling. It created a world where great powers' war against a much smaller, technologically unequal society could be over before the smaller society had any real chance to resist at all.
The fighting stopped looking like fighting and started looking like enforcement. That's the uncomfortable category the Anglo-Zanzibar War actually belongs to. Not wars in the old sense of contests, but something closer to a violent administrative correction, a reminder, delivered with naval gunfire, of who was actually in charge. The fact that it happened to also be the fastest one on record isn't really a coincidence. It's almost the logical endpoint of a war that was never actually a contest to begin with. If your enemy genuinely cannot resist you in any meaningful way, the war is just the amount of time it takes to make that fact undeniable to everyone watching. There's actually a name for exactly this pattern, and it predates the Anglo-Zanzibar War by decades: gunboat diplomacy.
The term describes a specific kind of coercive foreign policy that became almost routine for industrial naval powers throughout the 19th century. Park warships visibly within range of a target, a port, a capital, a palace, and use the implicit or explicit threat of bombardment to force a political outcome, without necessarily having to follow through. The goal, ideally, was never actually to fire. The goal was for the other side to look at the ships sitting in the harbor, do the math on what those ships were capable of, and capitulate before a single shot was needed. This had already played out repeatedly by 1896. The British had used exactly this tactic against China during the Opium Wars decades earlier. The phrase itself, gunboat diplomacy, became common enough in the language of the era that it stopped sounding like a euphemism and started just sounding like a category of normal foreign policy, something governments did, openly, without much need to disguise it as anything else.
What makes the Anglo-Zanzibar case so striking and so useful as an illustration is that it's gunboat diplomacy that failed at the diplomacy step and had to actually deliver on the gunboat part. Khalid called the bluff, and the empire, having made the threat publicly, in front of its own colonial subjects and rival European powers watching from their own consulates in the same city, essentially could not afford to back down without looking weak, not just in Zanzibar, but everywhere else they were running the same playbook. The 38 minutes of bombardment wasn't really about Zanzibar specifically. It was about every other contested succession, every other restive territory, watching to see what happened when someone said no to the Royal Navy. This is, by the way, the same logic underpinning something Gwyn Dyer's broader history of warfare returns to again and again. Deterrence and demonstration have always been at least as important as the actual fighting in how military power functions.
A war that ends in 38 minutes, with one side suffering a single minor injury, isn't really won in the battlefield sense. There was no contest to win. It's a message, sent in the only language that, at the time, every government in the region could be relied upon to read fluently: artillery fire. If you've ever come across the Anglo-Zanzibar War before today, it was probably in exactly the format we opened this video with: a trivia fact, a Guinness World Record, a did you know, shortest war in history, 38 minutes. Isn't that wild? And it is wild, but I think there's something worth noticing about how comfortably this event has settled into that trivia format, because it tells you something about how history gets processed and flattened over time. Reducing this to a fun fact does a specific kind of work. It makes the violence frictionless. Shortest war in history sounds almost like an achievement, a record like the world's tallest building or the fastest mile. It's the kind of fact that gets a chuckle on a quiz show. But sitting underneath that fact are 500 real casualties, people with names, families, positions in a real society, most of whom were not soldiers in any professional sense, but ordinary residents of Zanzibar town who ended up on the wrong side of a succession dispute they probably had limited say in. Khalid's claim to the throne wasn't pure theater. It had genuine domestic political weight, genuine supporters, a genuine, if doomed, belief that local legitimacy might matter more than a foreign veto.
And the framing of the war at the time in the British press leaned hard into exactly the kind of narrative you'd expect. Contemporary newspaper coverage from 1896 described the British action in the language of civilization correcting barbarism, framing Khalid's resistance and his supporters' culture in explicitly racialized, dismissive terms, the same rhetorical toolkit used across the entire colonial project of that era to justify whatever violence empire required. Reading that coverage now is uncomfortable, and it should be, because it shows you exactly how a 38-minute bombardment that killed 500 people got repackaged in real time as a tidy little lesson about progress.
This is the part of the story I think is actually the most important takeaway, more than the runtime. Shortest war in history is a genuinely fascinating, genuinely true historical fact, but it's also a piece of trivia that, by its very framing as trivia, makes it very easy to forget there were real people inside that palace when the shells started landing, and that the swift, almost comic efficiency of the British victory is also a direct, unfiltered measurement of how much more killing power one side had brought to the encounter than the other.
History compresses well-known short events into punchlines surprisingly easily. The shortest war, the smallest country, the fastest collapse. And there's nothing wrong with finding those facts genuinely interesting. I do. That's why we made this video. But it's worth occasionally pulling the thread a little further than the headline number, because almost every one of these fun facts has a much heavier story sitting directly underneath it, waiting for someone to actually ask why it happened, and at what cost, and to whom. So what actually came of all this? Hamoud bin Mohammed, Britain's chosen sultan, was installed that same afternoon and ruled, with British officials effectively running the actual machinery of government behind him until his death in 1902. Almost immediately, the new, fully compliant sultanate moved to formalize what Britain had wanted all along. In 1897, the legal status of slavery itself was abolished in Zanzibar, ending, at least on paper, the institution that had built the wealth this entire conflict was ultimately fought to control. Zanzibar remained a British protectorate for another 67 years, until 1963, when it gained independence. The following year, in 1964, it merged with mainland Tanganyika to form what is now Tanzania, where Zanzibar remains a semi-autonomous region to this day.
If you visit Stone Town now, the old quarter of Zanzibar town, today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, you can reportedly still find scarring in some of the old stonework from the 1896 bombardment, and the House of Wonders, rebuilt after the shelling, eventually became Zanzibar's National Museum until a partial collapse in 2020 led to extensive renovation, a building constructed to showcase electric light, the first in East Africa, that ended up most famous for the 38 minutes it spent on fire. And as for the larger pattern this war was a part of, European powers using overwhelming industrial military force to settle the internal politics of smaller, formally sovereign states, that pattern didn't end with the 19th century. It just got better dressed. The vocabulary changed. Gunboat diplomacy became, over the 20th and 21st centuries, intervention, peacekeeping, regime change, kinetic action.
Different words, often genuinely different in scale and method and intention, but built on the same underlying fact the Anglo-Zanzibar War demonstrated with such uncomfortable clarity. When the gap in military capability between two sides becomes large enough, the line between war and enforcement gets very, very thin, and the side with overwhelming capability rarely has much incentive to slow down and ask whether the other side is genuinely consenting to the outcome.
So, the shortest war in history, 38 minutes, a wooden palace, a disputed throne, and the most powerful navy on Earth. It's a fact that works perfectly as a piece of trivia, and I understand completely why it's the version of this story that's traveled the furthest. It's short, it's punchy, it's almost funny in its sheer disproportion. But I hope what you take away from this video isn't just the number. I hope it's the shape underneath the number, a moment, sitting right at the hinge between two very different eras of organized human violence. One where war was, however brutally, something close to a contest, and one where the gap in power had grown so wide that war became something closer to a formality, a violent rubber stamp on a decision that one side had already made unilaterally.
Khalid bin Barghash bet that the empire wouldn't actually pull the trigger. He was wrong, and the proof took 38 minutes to deliver. But the deeper bet, the one every contested government in that era was implicitly making, that local legitimacy and the will of your own people might still count for something against an empire with enough firepower to disagree, that's the bet that the entire 19th century, again and again, proved wrong as well. That's the actual shortest war in history, not the one measured in minutes, the one measured in how long it took the rest of the world to realize the rules had already changed.